The Dallas Cowboys continue to evaluate their roster as the offseason moves forward, and one of the most talked about situations right now involves the defensive line and the possibility of adding more talent before the new season begins. There's been a lot of discussion about available free agents, especially players who could strengthen the interior defensive line, and one name that keeps appearing in conversations is Christian Wilkins. He is a player who, when healthy, has proven he can be extremely impactful, especially against the run and as an interior pass rusher. However, the biggest concern surrounding him right now is not his talent, but his health and whether he can return to the level he played at before his injury. The situation becomes even more complicated when you look at the timeline of his recovery. He has been dealing with a foot injury for quite some time, and the fact that he is still rehabbing this late into the offseason raises some serious questions. Teams around the league are clearly monitoring his situation, and there are reports that many organizations have shown interest, but interest and actually signing a player are two very different things. Any team considering bringing him in will want detailed medical evaluations, workouts, and meetings before making a decision. This is not the type of move a team makes quickly, especially when injuries have kept a player off the field for such a long period of time. From a purely football perspective, there is no doubt that he would fit what the Cowboys like to do on defense. He is strong at the point of attack, he can disrupt running plays, and he has shown in the past that he can generate pressure from the interior, which is something every defense values. Interior pressure can completely change the way opposing quarterbacks play, and having someone who can collapse the pocket from the middle makes life easier for edge rushers. That is why, when you only look at his ability on the field, the idea of adding him makes a lot of sense. The problem is that roster decisions cannot be based only on past performance, especially when availability becomes a concern. The Cowboys also have to think about depth across the defensive line. Over the past months, there have been changes to the roster, and the team still needs more bodies in the rotation. A defensive line cannot rely on just a few players because the position requires constant rotation to keep players fresh throughout the game. That means even if the team signs a big name or drafts a rookie, they will still likely look for additional depth pieces, whether through free agency or later roster moves. Building a defensive line is not just about star players, but also about reliable rotational players who can step in and play meaningful snaps when needed. Another name that has been discussed as a possible fit is a veteran defensive tackle who has built his career as a strong run defender. However, the reality with many late free agents is that there is usually a reason they are still available. Sometimes it is age, sometimes injuries, and sometimes declining production. That does not mean they cannot help a team, but it does mean expectations have to be realistic. A veteran player at this stage of his career might not be a full-time starter anymore, but he could still contribute in specific situations, especially on early downs or short yardage situations where run defense is critical. The Cowboys front office has to balance short-term needs with long-term planning. Signing older players can help fill immediate gaps, but the team also needs to continue developing younger talent through the draft. The draft will likely play a huge role in how the rest of the roster is built, especially on defense. If the Cowboys draft a defensive tackle early, that could change how aggressive they are in free agency. On the other hand, if the draft board does not fall the way they expect, they may need to rely more on veteran free agents to fill those roster spots. Linebacker is another position that has been discussed a lot, especially when it comes to veteran players who are still available. A veteran linebacker can bring leadership, experience, and strong run defense. But the modern game also requires linebackers who can cover receivers and tight ends in space. That is where teams have to be careful when evaluating older players, because coverage ability is often the first thing to decline with age. Even if a veteran can still make tackles and read plays well, if he struggles in coverage, opposing offenses will target that weakness. The Cowboys coaching staff and front office are clearly evaluating all of these factors as they continue to shape the roster. Every move at this point in the offseason is about building depth, competition, and flexibility before training camp begins. There are still free agents available. There will be new players entering the league through the draft, and there will always be unexpected roster changes across the league that create new opportunities. The key for the Cowboys will be making smart, low-risk moves that improve the roster without creating long-term problems, especially when it comes to injured or aging players who may not be able to contribute for an entire season. As the offseason continues to unfold, the Cowboys find themselves in a familiar situation, trying to balance immediate needs with long-term planning while evaluating what is still available in free agency. This is the time of the year when teams must be very careful with decisions, because the players who remain unsigned often come with some level of risk. That risk could be related to injuries, age, declining production, or simply the financial expectations of the player. For Dallas, the priority appears to be adding depth, particularly on the defensive side of the ball, and making sure the roster is competitive heading into training camp. One of the biggest areas of concern remains the defensive front, not necessarily because there is no talent, but because depth across a long season is extremely important. Injuries always happen, rotations are necessary, and the physical nature of playing on the defensive line means that teams need multiple players ready to contribute. The Cowboys understand that relying too heavily on a small group of players can become a problem late in the season, especially when fatigue and injuries begin to accumulate. That is why even smaller signings or low-cost veteran deals can become very important over the course of a season, even if those moves do not make major headlines at the time they happen. Another factor the team must consider is how the defensive scheme will look moving forward and what type of players best fit that system. Not every talented player is automatically a perfect fit for every defensive scheme. Coaches look for specific traits, discipline and assignments, and players who can adapt to different situations during games. That means the Cowboys are not just looking for the most famous names still available, but for players who can fill very specific roles. Sometimes that means signing a veteran who understands positioning and assignments, even if he is not the same athlete he was earlier in his career. The draft will also play a major role in shaping the rest of the offseason. Teams often wait to see how the draft unfolds before making certain free agency decisions, because the draft can fill multiple needs at once. If the Cowboys are able to draft defensive players who can contribute immediately, that could reduce the urgency to sign certain veterans. However, if the draft does not address all the needs, the team may return to the free agent market and sign players who are still available after the draft. This happens every year, and some veterans actually prefer to wait until after the draft, so they have a clearer picture of which teams still need help at their position. There is also the leadership aspect to consider when signing veteran players. Younger teams often benefit from experienced players who understand preparation, film study, and the weekly routine of an NFL season. Even if a veteran is not playing every snap, his presence in the locker room and during practice can be valuable for younger players who are still learning how to be professionals at the highest level. Teams often talk about culture and leadership, and those things are not built only through star players, but also through experienced veterans who help maintain standards inside the organization. At the same time, the Cowboys must be careful not to rely too much on older players, especially at physically demanding positions like defensive line and linebacker. The speed of the game continues to increase. Offenses are more creative than ever, and defenses need players who can move well in space and adapt to modern offensive systems. That is why the combination of young talent from the draft and experienced veterans from free agency is usually the best approach. Too many young players can lead to inconsistency, while too many older players can lead to durability issues and lack of speed. Another important element in roster construction is competition. Teams do not just sign players to fill spots, they sign players to compete for spots. Competition during training camp often brings out the best in players, and sometimes unexpected players earn starting roles simply because they perform better in camp and preseason games. The Cowboys will likely bring several players into camp at positions like defensive tackle and linebacker, and not all of them will make the final roster. But creating that competition is important because it raises the overall level of the team. As the offseason continues, more moves will happen, whether through free agency, trades, or the draft. The roster that exists today will not be exactly the same when the season begins, and that is normal in the NFL. Teams are constantly adjusting, evaluating, and looking for ways to improve. For the Cowboys, the focus right now is clearly on strengthening the defense, adding depth, and making sure the team is more complete and more prepared for the long season ahead. The decisions made during this period may not always be the biggest headlines, but they often play a huge role in determining how successful a team will be once the season actually begins. The front office also has to keep an eye on financial flexibility, because every contract signed now can affect future moves during the season. Injuries during the year often force teams to sign players quickly, and having salary cap flexibility at that moment can make a big difference. That is why some teams prefer short-term contracts with veterans at this stage of the offseason. These deals usually come with low risk and give the team the option to move on if the player does not perform as expected. It is a strategy that allows teams to keep improving the roster without committing too much money long-term. Another important point is how the coaching staff plans to rotate players on defense. Defensive coordinators today rely heavily on rotations to keep players fresh, especially on the defensive line where the physical demands are very high. A deep rotation can keep pass rushers explosive late in games and late in the season. Games are often decided in the fourth quarter, and having fresh defensive linemen who can pressure the quarterback in the final minutes can be the difference between winning and losing. That is why depth on the defensive line is not just a luxury, but a necessity for teams that want to compete at a high level. The linebacker position also continues to be an area where the Cowboys could still make a move before the season begins. Modern linebackers need to be versatile. They must stop the run, rush the passer when needed, and most importantly, cover running backs and tight ends in the passing game. Offenses constantly try to create mismatches, and linebackers are often targeted in passing situations. Because of that, teams are very careful when choosing linebackers, especially veterans, because if they cannot keep up in coverage, opposing offenses will exploit that weakness repeatedly. As training camp gets closer, the urgency to finalize certain roster spots will increase. Coaches want to enter camp with a clear idea of who will compete for starting jobs and who will be fighting for backup roles. The more clarity a team has before camp, the more productive camp practices usually are. However, there are always surprises during training camp. Every year, there are players who are not expected to make the team, but perform so well that they earn a roster spot. There are also veterans who struggle and end up losing their position to younger players. That competition is a critical part of building a strong team. The Cowboys are clearly still evaluating multiple options and keeping their plans flexible. They understand that roster building is not just about one big move, but about many smaller decisions that together create a balanced and competitive team. Depth, versatility, health, and financial flexibility all play a role in these decisions. Fans often focus on big names, but many times the most important moves are the smaller ones that improve depth and create competition across the roster.